Welcome everyone to this year's Distinguished Global Migrations Lecture hosted by the Ignatian Center's Bannan Forum. I'm Aaron Willis, Director of the Bannan Forum. And the Bannan Forum is focused on but not limited to the intersection of faith, culture, and questions of justice. And our programming is meant to promote and make accessible the comprehensive humanism of the Jesuit intellectual heritage, bringing it to bear on contemporary realities. Through public events, the Bannan Forum brings the Santa Clara University community into conversations emerging from our distinctive character and mission. The Global Migrations Distinguished Lecture was created to provide a space to explore and reflect on a subject that has a critical space in our contemporary world and a topic that is central to Catholic social thought. Sorry, I got all that mixed up. Reflecting on a concern for the dignity of all people and the call to be in solidarity with our neighbors, the question of the rights of migrants and the responsibility to respond to their needs is a pressing concern nationally and across the globe, as we know. And so I'm happy that this annual lecture engages themes and topics that are at the heart of the issues that should be central to a Jesuit university's concerns, but also that it engages scholars and leaders like Mr. Kerwin, who approach the work in ways that exemplify the type of contemplation and action that is the fundamental characteristic of Jesuit education. Linking our 4 C's at Santa Clara, competence, conscience, compassion, community, the work of the Jesuit Refugee Service and Mr. Kerwin are critically important to understanding how our world and how our institutional mission might be lived out in the world. Given our context and the importance of understanding how we as a Jesuit Catholic University are called to respond to this issue, I'm extremely grateful for Mr. Kerwin's willingness to be here and talk with our community. So I'm happy now to introduce him and welcome him. So Donald Kerwin is Vice President for Advocacy Research and Partnerships for the Jesuit Refugee Service USA. Mr. Kerwin has held leadership positions in the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, the Migration Policy Institute, and the Clinic for Migration Studies of New York, or the Center for Migration Studies of New York. He has also served on many boards, special commissions, and advisory groups. He served as a fellow with the Woodstock Theological Center and a senior fellow with the MPI. Mr. Kerwin writes and speaks extensively on international migration, refugee protection, U.S. immigration law, human rights, and Catholic social teaching. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Migration and Human Security, and he also serves as ED Emeritus at CMS on the Academic Advisory Council for the Global Attention Project in Geneva, and on the editorial board of International Migration Review. And so welcome, Donald, and thank you for being here.
Well, I'm going to be speaking today about forcibly displaced persons and kind of a Catholic framework for understanding forcible displacement, and also the work of Jesuit Refugee Service. I'll also discuss the Trump administration's policies over the last 18 months. But I wanted to start with some words of gratitude, actually. I really was taken by the Bannan Forum's role in promoting the mission of Santa Clara, and I had a son who went here, and when we came out and listened to kind of what Santa Clara University was trying to do, we were extraordinarily impressed with it and wanted him to come here. And, by extension, the Bannan Forum's ability to instill a sense of vocation in its students, its faculty, and in its broader community, too. Even as a teenager, I have to say, I was hoping to pursue a vocation in life, although I didn't, at that time, of course, have the language to describe that. But I've always felt at home and supported in the Jesuit world. And I've regularly relied on, friends, colleagues, classmates in all of my work. It's, I think, a particular honor for me to be here tonight with Father Bill O'Neill, who I've always known and had the wisdom to turn to with my questions and for his wisdom, and who I've admired for many, many years. Bill was the first person I actually heard speak about the need for Catholic social learning and listening. And I've always appreciated his poetically rich and very intense writing. I've also known and valued work with Father Tom Smolich over the years in many different capacities, including his 8-year stint as the director of Jesuit Refugee Service's International Office. And I wanted to acknowledge, too, Vanji Abriel, who was a terrific colleague at the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, and who I remember even before then is a clinical professor at Tulane University. Thanks to Aaron and to Mary and to everyone else responsible for organizing this gathering. And finally, I just wanted to say a word of gratitude to the Society of Jesus itself for the many ways it's intersected with my own family. My dad was the first from our side of the family to attend college. He went to Fairfield University. He was from Waterbury, Connecticut. Back in those days, Fairfield was a boarding school, and they called themselves the Men in Red. So things have changed quite a bit since then. And growing up, I learned actually that every other university in the country, even Georgetown, where he taught, suffered in comparison to Fairfield. He also taught us, being from Waterbury and being Catholic, I think, at that time, to root for the underdogs in life, and was grateful always to the Society of Jesus for educating him and young people like him. Finally, as I said, my son Joseph went here, my daughter-in-law as well. We're both students, and had a great experience. And we have a little grandchild, Lewis, who's a baby Bronco in our family now, so we're happy about that. So we have this great personal connection to Santa Clara, too. I wanted to talk a little bit about Jesuit Refugee Service to start with. And this particular quote, I think, is a good way to start. It's kind of a signature characteristic of Jesuit Refugee Service to accompany people. The pillars of the work are reflected in this composition of its staff. It's about a third volunteer, a third refugees themselves, and the rest of us. And I think the rest of us is the least important part of it. 2 weeks after I arrived, the second Trump administration assumed office. And on its first day in office, the president issued a series of executive orders, including this one, including one on foreign assistance. And I see that, let me jump to that. And you can read it, but basically why don't we both read it? But basically it's saying that foreign assistance isn't aligned with America's interests and its values, and in fact it's antithetical to U.S. values. But I think that really depends on what we mean by American interests and values, right? The administration also inveighs against waste and fraud and abuse, but its method of reducing waste, fraud, and abuse has all but ensured greater waste, fraud, and abuse. And it has also spoken about its transactional understanding of international humanitarian assistance. I've been in discussions with NGOs and UN officials on how Sudan and South Sudan might help to promote U.S. wealth and prosperity. That seems to turn assistance on its head, really. And I think the Danforth quote points to something that's really real, which is it's almost impossible to recognize America sometimes in America first, or the America that we understand. The focus is not aid based on need, but as a source of oil and mining opportunities in some of these conversations, kind of an old-fashioned extraction ethic. Another theme that we hear quite a bit about is remigration, by which the administration means sending migrants back to their home countries. JRS's State Department-funded programs actually expanded during the first Trump administration, and this is what JRS was doing at the time. Is any of this un-American? Is any of it un-Christian? Education of Sudanese refugees in 21 camps, foster care for unaccompanied children, refugee children from Myanmar and India, mental health and psychosocial support for Yazidi women in Iraq. I think we know what they've been through. medical and rent assistance for refugees in Thailand, livelihood training for urban refugees, and on and on. The rehabilitation and mental health services for Sudanese refugees in South Sudan, and integration services to 9,000, because you always have to provide numbers to the federal government, Venezuelan refugees in Colombia. I was actually working for the Scalabrini priests at the time of the Venezuelan crisis, and they were in Cucuta providing food as people crossed the border, and we were there for opening shelters in both Chile and in Lima, Peru. So, people were basically fleeing for their lives and trying to send home food for money and food and medicine and the like. I think a couple of weeks after the inauguration, what happened was that JRS received notice from the administration that its State Department funded programs would all be reviewed and paused for 90 days. The administration subsequently, after some kind of furious advocacy, clarified that it would not be suspending life-saving services during its review of the humanitarian programs, and it would be considering waiver requests based on what was life-saving. And of course, we rushed to meet that deadline and describe what we did as life-saving. It defined life-saving, though, kind of as a tautology, I guess. What's life-saving? Well, it's core to life-saving services. Yeah, we know. And I think we never viewed life-saving in quite this narrow way that the administration does. And we've tried to, in our testimony and in our other work, argue for a broader view of life-saving, more than providing the bare minimum to allow people to survive or to subsist in misery and despair. That's kind of the Jesuit ethic of cura personalis, which is, everybody here I'm sure knows, means care for the whole person. It recognizes that personhood and human dignity require a response to material needs, certainly, but also to people's deepest hopes, convictions, and their loves, too, such as their love of their family and their protection of their family. In any event, for all the administration's concerns about fraud, it was the waiver process itself that turned out to be a totally fraudulent process. 7 of the 9 agreements that we had, which had been negotiated and signed, were soon terminated. There was no cause provided. There was no explanation provided. There was no rationale provided. And we received that notice before we even received a response to our rushed waiver application. The remaining 2 DOS-funded programs were soon terminated and have since, have since lapsed. And they, in total, these programs weren't like major grants, were not like Catholic Relief Services with the kind of federal funding that they get, but they were significant, and they constituted 20% of the Jesuit Refugee Service budget globally. Refugee staff lost jobs, services were cut, programs were lost entirely, including the work with the women in Iraq. And JRS USA spent most of the year trying to raise private funds to keep the vestige of these initiatives open. Remember, too, that this was totally and completely unnecessary because Congress had already authorized and appropriated all of this funding. I think it's something of a triumph of the Jesuit Refugee Service model of accompaniment and localization that most of these programs remain open in some form. The communities are still there. The programs have survived, but I don't want to sugarcoat it either. There's been a big loss, too. A survey, how much did the U.S. government save by cutting our programs, or saved by cutting 86% of all of the programs that it was funding within 2 months without any kind of thought or concern or knowledge about what they did? We commissioned a survey, and in the survey it was of Catholics, and Catholics thought that about 20% of the U.S. budget went for international humanitarian assistance. 20%, that's a lot. In fact, the refugee budget in our analysis, the spending was 12% of 1% of the U.S. budget, so 0.0012. Not a lot for what they did. I think obviously JRS is a relatively small NGO. You can multiply JRS's experience by roughly 3,000 to get a sense of the devastation caused in 2 short months. Is the Trump administration cut, 86% of this funding. Moreover, other development states kind of followed the U.S.'s bad example, cutting support for desperate groups and for the low and middle income states that host these groups. The devastation took the form of lost lives, lost prospects, lost expertise, lost partnerships, lost oversights. It'd be very difficult to rebuild it at any time soon. The administration vehemently argued, however, that the cuts didn't lead to any loss of lives. We had that all wrong. But in 2000, for the very first time, child mortality increased. Since 2000, it increased for the very first time by 200,000 deaths of children under age 5 that have been clearly traced to these abrupt and thoughtless cuts in aid. So you might ask, how is this all playing out kind of on Capitol Hill, which is where we spend a lot of our time? I think the appropriators, Republican and Democrat, understand these problems. Most are angry, but they're particularly angry at the way that they've been bullied, and in the way that their constitutional power over the purse has been more or less usurped. Angry about that. And of course, we know that Republicans very rarely challenge the president directly, although they do, in fairness, have supported funding for a lot of these programs and have supported putting guardrails around the administration so that the president has to use the money in the way that they designate that it be used. There was for example, in kind of one of the reports of one of the appropriations bills, they're basically asking for very strict reporting on how many people do you have on staff to actually manage programs that we're asking to be funded. And the fact is they don't have people to manage the programs. They don't have the expertise. They've lost all of that. I think not all of them are sympathetic, however. And I wanted to provide an example of an unsympathetic meeting that we have so you can get a sense of how those go. So if you wanted to be an advocate, you wouldn't have to be afraid because you don't need to be an expert on these issues. This meeting was with a high-level staffer of an influential senator whose office was devoted to the mission of the misnamed Department of Government Efficiency, so DOGE. We couldn't see this staffer because it was a remote meeting and he had darkened the screen. So I don't know, that's not a great way to communicate. There's not a lot of bonding that takes place in that situation. And what he mostly wanted to talk about was fraud, waste, and abuse and the abstract, the president's concern with it, not how JRS or other successful humanitarian programs worked or who they served. And at one point, he said something to me like, well, it's very well for advocates like yourself to make clever appeals because, that's your job. But the president's very concerned with fraud, waste, and abuse. That's the fact. And at which point, one of our members had pretty much had enough, and she interrupted him and said, I think there's some confusion here. He said, I actually live in your state. And I'm very active in my parish, which she named. And I'm quite familiar with JRS programs. I've supported them for years. And I'm also familiar with the work of Catholic Relief Services, which I've supported for years, and the work of the church and Catholic social teaching. My husband is actually a military veteran. He served 2 terms in Iraq, and he's now a tenured professor in the state university. We have 3 children They attend Catholic school, and we're having weekly rice bowl meals at this point, sending the kids to school with the money that they save. And we do this mostly not to contribute money, but because we want our children to understand what it means to live in a wealthy country in a world of great hunger and need. We want them to understand their faith growing up. So that's my perspective as a constituent, and I'd appreciate it if you shared that with your boss. And the staffer was still behind that black screen, but he didn't talk much for the rest of the meeting, I can tell you that. And I think the truth is that he and the Trump administration don't know much about refugees or the U.S. work on humanitarian programs. And they don't honestly seem that interested in learning much about it either. So I think, I don't give up on any of that, but I just feel like we have a lot of work to do, and some of that just falls on us to educate people that might agree with us at this point on what these programs have done and do. The Catholic Church is very concerned, in a way that the administration is not, about refugees and about forcibly displaced persons. It's also concerned about persons living in insecure, often calamitous conditions in their countries of origin, who may or may not consider migrating. There were 117 million forcibly displaced persons as of last June, and that's definitely an undercount. Why are there so many, and why is this number growing? I mean, because far too little has been done to prevent and mitigate the underlying conditions that lead to displacement. And the traditional permanent or durable solutions to displacement aren't keeping pace, as this slide suggests. Host states favor safe and voluntary return generally, as do many of the forcibly displaced people themselves. They'd like to go home. They hope to go home. And so there's a significant number who do return, but it's not at scale. Conflicts and other refugee-producing conditions linger on, and new crises arise pretty much every year. That's almost invariable. In addition, when people return home prematurely, that almost always leads to subsequent displacement, so they leave again. Refugee host communities can be generous in a lot of ways, but many see forcibly displaced persons solely as temporary residents. They don't see them as becoming citizens. Third country resettlement, which used to be available to only about 1% of the refugee population worldwide, has basically been abandoned by the United States at this point, which was always the main refugee resettlement country. Complementary forms of protection, like allowing refugees to migrate as workers or as family members or with private sponsors, that's been promising, but the numbers have been modest in the scheme of things as well. And so for all these reasons, what we see are situations of protracted displacement, which are very common worldwide at this time. Beth Ferris at Georgetown University and I, we did a special edition of papers of the journal that I edit, the Journal on Migration and Human Security, in 2023 on protracted displacement worldwide. And we found that about 3/4 of the displaced had been here for protracted periods, defined as a group of 25,000 refugees from the same country of origin who've been in exile in low or middle income countries for at least 5 consecutive years. That definition itself understates the number of people in protracted displacement. And the number of internally displaced people who are in protracted displacement is about the same percentage. So you have these forever refugees who live their lives in camps, as do their children and even their grandchildren. And I think Father Bill can talk about that because he's lived in those camps. I've started to hear scholars arguing that life in camps might be the best solution the world can provide to some refugees. So, so we might consider it. We should maybe start considering it an acceptable alternative. It's certainly the de facto alternative for many people. But that's, very problematic for the reasons that Father Bill has said and put very succinctly, which that camps, quote, conspire to deny the very rights that they're intended to protect. That's the problem with warehousing people in camps. Beyond international humanitarian assistance, JRS is active on U.S. refugee, resettlement, and immigration policy. Mass deportation policies have dramatically impacted targeted communities, but also Jesuit and Catholic institutions around the country and the people that they serve. I particularly follow, and I got to tell you, it's kind of dispiriting sometimes, the despicable language that's consistently used to justify and to try to sustain and shore up support for these policies. In this warped universe, immigrants are invaders, they're snakes, they're vermin, they're polluters of blood, nation's blood, they're rapists, they're criminals, they're pet eaters. Their communities of origin are attacked. Remember, Trump called Haiti a filthy, dirty, disgusting S-hole country back when. Stephen Miller, who's kind of his theorist of the administration, but also the implementer of all of these things, has championed the concept of collective guilt. Now, that's really something. And under collective guilt, if someone's from Haiti, or an undocumented person, or a refugee, and they commit a crime, it's blamed on all the Haitians, and all the undocumented persons, and all the refugees, and that gives rise to some kind of an argument for a crackdown of some kind. You might ask yourself, why is it always blamed on somebody's race, or somebody's country, or somebody's religion, or somebody's ethnicity, or somebody's immigration status? I use this example. My name's Donald. I have, bad hair. I've always had bad hair. I have no control over it. There's another Donald that's more prominent than I am, has got the same name and the same problem that I have. I don't get blamed for his decisions, do I? No. Because it's arbitrary that we have the same name and we have the same bad hair. In other words, why would you pick out race or somebody's nationality and say, okay, that they're all collectively guilty as a result of that? The undocumented have particularly been vilified as the worst of the worst. Cardinal McElroy of D.C., though, has insisted that this population possesses, and this is a quote, precisely the religious, cultural, communitarian, and familial bonds that are most frayed and most valuable in this moment in our country's history. I got to say, when he talks like that, and at the Mass where he said these things, he got, at the end, a 3-minute standing ovation. I've never seen anything like it before. People are hungry for the truth out there. The overwhelming majority of those arrested and detained by ICE with the support of the Border Patrol, think about this, support of the Border Patrol, support of the National Guard, support of the U.S. Marines, and federal and state law enforcement agencies have no criminal convictions or have been arrested for ordinary immigration violations. They're essential workers at higher rates. That was clear during COVID-19. We ran the numbers. We know that for a fact. They populate our pews at higher rates. They contribute to U.S. retirement programs, and they'll never get anything out of them. They employ others because they're self-employed at higher rates. They have children at higher rates, and they volunteer at higher rates. Many arrived legally. Others are on a path to permanent residence. They exemplify what are thought to be emblematic U.S. values: hard work, self-sacrifice, family. Emblematic values. In Catholic thought, they're a gift. They're not a burden. And let me personalize the effect of these mass deportation policies just for a second by telling a story that I heard from a friend. And this particular friend, which some of you may know, has for years and years run a parish-based organizing program that's now become a national program. And in this model that she's created, she's an immigrant herself, basically immigrant parishes. They develop leaders. They identify some of the challenges that the people in the parish are facing. They identify how the community itself can meet those challenges and what additional resources they might need from the mainstream Catholic and other agencies. She called me not too long ago, and she just had one of the normal parish meetings. And the leader got up to talk, and it was mostly a group of women, and most of them had been very affected by the deportations in the area at that time, including a number whose husbands had been picked up, arrested, and had been incommunicado because they're moving people from place to place, detention center to detention center, so that they can't be found by counsel, they can't be found by courts, they can't be found by family. That's one of the things that's going on. And the lady started to speak, and she couldn't speak. And she broke down as she started to tell her story. And so they turned to another woman, and she was going to say what was on her mind, but she couldn't get it out either. And then they turned to another person, and of course the women usually work as well. They couldn't work. They didn't feel they could leave their homes. They couldn't bring their kids to school. They were stuck. They just didn't know what to do. And the third woman couldn't speak either. And at that point, they just ended the meeting, but everybody cried. And they cried for the entire length of the meeting and kind of comforted each other. And my friend said, you know what? This was the best meeting that we've had in 3 months, or 2 months. Because everybody realized at that point that they were in the same situation. They knew who they could count on, and they knew what they were up against, and they knew that they were in it together. The best meeting that they'd had in several weeks. I think there's a lesson there. One of them is this is happening in a Catholic parish. I mean, we should all be shocked by that and ashamed by that, and our co-religionists should all be ashamed by that too. And the solution is really kind of in that room. This slide shows some of our kind of advocacy positions. On our recent Advocacy Day, we have some of our advocates in the room with us, including the entire California delegation. So thanks to all of you for kind of, maybe you can raise your hand. Come on, we'll get some applause here. All right. Like an all-star cast. Let me provide some of the other, these are fairly straightforward, but some of the other kind of troubling things that we've seen, which we're advocating on regularly. Of course, there's the arrest and there's the disappearance of people into the detention system, where they become unreachable. And those few that are released, and I've been involved in cases like this, are often released somewhere else in the country, or they're deported, but they're not given back any of their possessions when that happens. So no ID, no cell phone, no money. I was involved in a case where somebody from New Jersey was being released in Louisiana. Try to get back from Louisiana with no money, no ID, no cell phone. I mean, it's like, why are they doing that? Politicians in both parties have criticized the brutality and the lawlessness of this enforcement action. The administration's goal has been to arrest 3,000 immigrants a day, but it can't meet that goal. And so to come close, it is sought systematically to strip people of legal status, legal immigrants, particularly those with temporary protected status or humanitarian parole. So people who are here based on their protection needs and their humanitarian needs. It's ramped up deportations to dangerous third countries in which people have no connections whatsoever. In El Salvador, U.S. deportees were beaten, raped, and tortured. The U.S. is now negotiating, we read in the paper today, to send 1,100 Afghans who are awaiting U.S. visa processing processing in Qatar to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. 1,100. I mean, what the hell's going on there? On refugee resettlement, this was the program that basically unified the Catholic Church for years and years across generations in the United States. The administration paused, and if you ever hear them say paused, it means it's over, right? They paused, they suspended, and they then effectively ended the U.S. refugee resettlement program, one of the most stellar humanitarian programs in U.S. history that saved more than 3 million lives since 1980. At one point, Catholic institutions had settled more refugees than any other entity in the world, not counting the U.S. government itself, so more than any other state. The program's been reduced to record low admissions and to receiving white Afrikaners, some of whom are taking like the very un-refugee-like step of not being happy with the quality of life here, so they're returning home. Meanwhile, the roughly 100,000 refugees who were vetted, who really are at risk where they're living, and who were approved for admission prior to 2025, have been left stranded and forced to start all over again. That whole long, multi-year process where success is sometimes unlikely of trying to find a permanent home. That's totally and completely heartbreaking, and it's totally and completely unjust. The administration dislikes protection humanitarian programs overall. Those who had scheduled asylum interviews at the U.S.-Mexico border with an app, which was the only way to get an interview at the end of the Biden administration, they'd been waiting for a long time in Mexico for their interviews. As soon as the new administration came in, it canceled all those interviews. They remained stranded in Mexico. Since then, the administration has cut entry by asylum seekers by 99%. It's effectively closed the U.S.-Mexico border for asylum. Asylum seekers in the U.S. are being summarily removed from the U.S. immigration courts and placed in expedited removal. Detained asylum seekers aren't being released into the community, and ICE pressures them to agree to their own deportation in order to keep their families intact and to retain custody of their children. I think I'd like to just kind of read you, if you don't, I might be going over a little bit here, but I think it's important to kind of talk about some of these cases. And this is these are a couple of cases that were reported on by Human Rights First and Raices in a recent report on family detention in Dilley, Texas. And here's one. A family from Colombia lived in the United States for 2 years and built a stable life in New York while awaiting for their trafficking victim visa application to be processed by DHS. Both parents were working, they had valid work permits, and their daughter was thriving in school. The family complied with their immigration reporting requirements and attended a routine check-in appointment, at which time they were all apprehended. They were held in custody from early morning until late evening without adequate food, and they were placed under constant surveillance during that time. In the early hours of the following day, ICE transferred them by plane to Dilley. For the following 2 months, the family was detained in the same prison, but separated from one another. All physical contact was prohibited. The family could only briefly see each other during meals and were repeatedly warned not to touch or to provide any comfort to one another during those times. Another one. Even infants are separated from their parents within Dilley. A legal service provider shared with us that her client, an Irish mother detained with her 2-month-old baby, was housed separately from her spouse and father of the newborn, forcing her to assume all of the caretaking responsibilities. They're in the same place, right? Without any support. Though her sister-in-law was detained with her, the guards prohibited the sister-in-law from holding the baby to allow the mother to shower, forcing the mother to hold her infant, even while she showered or used the toilet. On and on and on. 36 pages of these stories. Confirmed stories. Statelessness, there used to be a kind of a fledgling process in the United States to encourage stateless people to come forward and to be screened to see if they were eligible for anything. The administration ended that. The administration's also created this paper wall of administrative fees, income and vetting requirements, and other barriers to advancing in legal status to permanent residence and citizenship. It's also sought, as you probably have seen, to end birthright citizenship. I think I skipped one there. Yep. And I think it's not going to prevail in that. It can't possibly prevail because the 14th Amendment itself is quite clear on this, as is the leading case, as is the fact that what they're talking about are the parents of, the legal status of the parents of children, not the fact that the 14th Amendment doesn't mention parents at all, actually. It just mentions being born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. I think, let me just, before I get into the church teaching on this, I think mass deportation, as you know, it's been accompanied by mass detention. I went back recently and looked at an article that was written in 1996 where they lamented the fact that the detention system had grown from 6,200 beds a night to 8,000. During COVID-19, it shrunk a little bit to 20,000 per night. The president signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act into law on July 4th of 2025, as if that were some victory for patriotism. But what that bill did is it provided $170 billion for immigration enforcement, including $45 billion for detention alone, through September 30th of 2029, including for family detention, like those cases that we were just talking about in Dilley. In certain centers, what they're doing is they're requiring women to buy water or get basically rotten water that makes their kids sick. And if the women don't have the money to do that, too bad. You know, their kids get sick. That's well documented at this point. So, like, why the cruelty, and why would you fund these systems to do that kind of thing? The $170 billion, what it does is it translates into 118,000 beds per night, which translates into 1.4 million detainees per year if the average stay is 30 days. That represents a 14-fold increase in ICE's budget in just 10 years, 14-fold. And this comes at the height of the concerns over its enforcement tactics and its brutality. This makes ICE better funded than all other federal law enforcement agencies, including the FBI and Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and the drug agencies and the like, than all of them combined. And, you know, 25% of the FBI budget is apparently focused on immigration enforcement now, too. To add insult to injury, basically the Senate and the House just approved additional funding for detention through 2029. I think it's time to go to Catholic social teaching because I don't want to depress you too much. So I wanted to talk about kind of an ethical framework which we think resonates quite well with people, Catholic and not. And what the framework provides is that you have to think about international migration more broadly and in a more integrated way than our administration does. And it provides that human beings have the freedom to remain, and this is a core Catholic teaching. That means to thrive in their home communities or in states where they've settled and put down roots. When that's not possible, they have the freedom to emigrate to a better situation. And they enjoy the freedom to return home, which is also recognized under international law, as that quote from Pope Francis indicates. It's a teaching that's rooted in human dignity, but also in a recognition of the agency and the freedom of human beings. The teaching opposes coerced immobility and coerced mobility. The goal is to make sure that none of these things are coerced in the future. That's what we should be working to. I think Kristen Hires, who was a professor here, I think, right, before Boston College, her quote points to state responsibilities and the need for a more integrated, holistic approach to migration than the enforcement-only approach that we have. In this approach, she's absolutely right. It places all the burdens on migrants for the shortcomings of states. That's really what it does. States have basically responsibilities, and those responsibilities go beyond enforcement. They're supposed to create the conditions that allow people to stay, to migrate safely elsewhere, to return, to welcome, promote, and protect and integrate immigrants, in Pope Francis's words, consistent with the good of their countries. Under the Catholic principle of subsidiarity, it also accentuates the agency of persons to make decisions on staying or migrating, however constrained and bad those decisions may be. Those decisions rest with the people themselves. Why? Because they're in the best position to make life-changing, consequential decisions for themselves and for their families, and they have the greatest stake in the outcome of those decisions. Freedom in the Catholic tradition is not about choosing bad things. It's about pursuing goods, like the well-being of family, or to escape persecution. It's the right word to use at this point, I think, freedom, because there's so much coercion. The teaching is also responsive to an international migration paradox, and that paradox, I think, is important to understand. And it is that those who need to migrate the most often cannot migrate at all, or if they do migrate, they can't migrate safely and legally. And when in desperation they do migrate, they're often then subject to predation by criminals, and they're treated as criminals by the states that arrest them and detain them. Many of us here today, not all of us probably, but we don't really need to migrate in the same way, but we mostly can migrate legally and safely. The slide identifies some of the populations I think that this teaching speaks to most strongly. Father Dan Carew, who's JRS's outgoing regional director of the Mideast and North Africa region, has spoken recently about the trials and tribulations of Lebanon. Lebanon was a country of 4 million, about the size of Connecticut, which received 1.5 million Syrians in a short time in 2011, 2012, after the war started. Since March 2nd of this year, the second war has killed more than 2,600 in Lebanon, injured more than 8,000, and displaced 1.2 million, which is 20% of the country. John Paul II in 1997 called Lebanon more than a country, it's a message. It's a message of freedom and an example of pluralism for East and West. But I think the converse is also true. When multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies don't work, it's far easier to divide them than to build them up. That's, I think, a lesson and an unfortunate reality in the United States now, too. How do the Trump administration policies, fare under the freedom to stay, migrate, and return? Well, I mean, first, the administration, what it does is it seeks to dehumanize with its rhetoric. And so do its mass deportation policies and its detention policies. They're dehumanizing policies. They go well beyond what they have to, even on their own terms. By contrast, what this teaching teaches is that human dignity, rights, equality, freedom, agency, they're the foundation, the very foundation of the teaching. The Trump administration seems to revel in its own cruelty, honestly, just to be honest. Whether it's at Alligator Alcatraz, or the way it terrorizes targeted communities, or the way it celebrated terminating all those life-saving programs. One of its signature efforts to end birthright citizenship would create a permanent underclass in the United States, almost a caste system. The Catholic Church recognizes the need for regulated, orderly borders, which can contribute to the common good if they're a part of a broader set of protection and legal immigration policies but they're not in this case. How have we contributed to the right to stay over the last several months? Well, we've cut off crucial funding that would allow people to stay at home. We haven't, the U.S. has not promoted the freedom to migrate, but has sought to halt the migration of desperate persons and has enlisted other states in that effort. It's effectively ended the ability of refugees to be resettled and asylees to get asylum. It's imposed travel bans on 75 countries and created barriers to legal immigration. It's prioritized involuntary migration, first through transfers from detention center to detention center, and finally to deportation. It's rejected the right to stay in the United States of long-term undocumented residents, even those with good moral character, which most of them have, of course, and it's added to the ranks of deportable people by illegalizing or stripping status from temporary residents. It's created such hostile conditions that it hopes that people will self-deport, which is kind of a contradiction in terms. Even in these circumstances, it might assist deportees to reintegrate into communities where they've not lived for decades or forever, but it's not even doing that, to be honest. So, like closing reflections, I think I'm pretty sure Father Bill's going to ask me, what's the good news in all this? And I think I love these two quotes. The first is by Dorothy Day, who wrote this letter to a friend who was disappointed about the impact of her work and the seeming indifference of her co-religionists to what she was doing. And I love that first sentence, discouragement is a temptation of the devil, right? I mean, people don't so much believe in the devil anymore, but I actually do, to be honest. Dr. King's quote, he wrote these words at the height of an earlier human rights movement, which now seems part of a continuous fight over the character and the nature of our country. Father Brian Massengale at Fordham University recently said, shocked everybody, he said, folks, you got to recognize that we have enemies in this. He said, if we don't have enemies, why was Jesus always preaching that we had to forgive them? I thought that was a good line. And I think it's not just like, it's not enemies exactly. Maybe what he's pointing to more deeply is the problem of sin. And what I'd like to acknowledge is that's our communal problem. It's my problem. I heard a parish priest say early on, who used to work for USAID, as it turned out, that the Gospel of John used a particular word to refer to giving in to the temptation of wealth, power, and standing. What was that word? Do you all know? He called it the world. That's the world, okay, in John's Gospel. Political leaders, I think they come and go. Their handlers say all sorts of things. The leaders even portray themselves as godlike sovereigns and saviors, I mean, as Trump has done. But I'm told that in Syria, they do come and go. And Bashar al-Assad, photos kind of before he left were omnipresent with the inscription, our leader forever. Everywhere they were, our leader forever, photo of him. And yet he disappeared, fleeing to Russia in December of 2024, leaving behind his followers and many family members, as it turned out, too. And the inscription changed almost overnight from our leader forever to forever is over. It's over. So I think the question that we have is, how can we rebuild and create something more enduring and better than what's been lost? I'm not rosy about this. I think it's going to take a long time, and it's going to take a lot of conversion on our parts and on other people's parts. And while faith-based agencies and refugees and immigration advocates will play a role in the rebuilding, I think we definitely don't have all the answers. Father Carew also said in the same talk that I heard that Jesus taught us to pray, our Father, not the us versus them Father, okay? And I'm coming back always to Matthew 25's gospel, where he spoke about the judgment of nations, of peoples who don't welcome the stranger. That's us. That's on us. We're part of that. We're part of the nation and people that's, for whatever reason at this point, not living up to its values, and that's our fault as well. We're called in also to be in communion with each other. So what do we do? I mean, I was privileged to hear Sister Norma Pimentel speak recently about God, faith, and family. And she said, you know what they are? They're one and the same thing. God, faith, and family. She expressed the need for a theology of welcoming and presence in the stranger, to the stranger. And she's argued that encounter creates family and reveals the presence of God and those created in his likeness, which we all are. When present to displaced persons, she says, you'll know what to do and say because you'll be in the presence of God. It's that simple. You'll become a witness to God's presence in the community of those who are present. That's how we see it. That's how I see it. It's clear that it's a moment for solidarity with refugees and immigrants whose dignity is not being honored at this moment. So we're trying to particularly mobilize for our refugee and immigrant brothers and sisters, but we're not writing anybody off. We have a hard road ahead, but whoever said it would be easy? Not Dorothy Day, that's for sure. Okay, let me stop there. Thank you. And for those who want to know how to get involved in Jesuit refugee service work, that's some information for you. And if you want to learn and read more about kind of the freedom to stay, migrate, and return, those are some references. So thank you.
Thank you, Donald, for that rich and thought-provoking talk, and we're excited to continue the conversation and to help us start to process everything that you shared and to think about all the different ideas. I'm very happy to welcome my colleague, Father Bill O'Neill, up to offer a few remarks. And Father O'Neill is a scholar in residence at the Ignatian Center and the director of immigration ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. And he's a professor emeritus of social ethics at the Jesuit School of Theology. Father O'Neill's writings address questions of human rights, ethics, and humanetic theory, social recognition, reconciliation and conflict resolution, and refugee policy. He has worked with refugees in Tanzania and Malawi, and has done research on human rights in South Africa and Rwanda. Father O'Neill received the Newcomb Fellowship, a Lilly Theological Research Grant, and held the Jesuit chair at Georgetown University from 2003 to 2004. He has his educational background includes receiving a licentiate of sacred theology from the Jesuit School of Theology and a PhD from Yale University. So welcome to Father Bill, and look forward to the conversation after.
Just a few brief remarks, and first a real word of gratitude to Don for really an inspirational talk. Thank you, Don. When we took the first steps from our lands, we did not know the future. Those were dark, uncertain moments. We lost everything. Charity Lobo spoke of fleeing with his family from the war-ravaged South Kivu region of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And like many of the other refugees in Kenya's vast Kakuma refugee camp, his family was caught between stories, the stories that refugees tell and the stories told of them, stories of loss, of displacement. In fact, the very title, Refugees, signifies the unmaking of their world and their insertion into a world made by others. An insertion, as Don has told us, that is increasingly met with hostility and xenophobia. Literally and figuratively, displaced refugees and internally displaced persons become, in Hannah Arendt's words, frightening symbols of difference as such. And as Don has told us, they are legion. For 3 years, I served in the Kakuma refugee camp in northwestern Kenya, now home to over 300,000 refugees from 20 different countries. It was part of our Jesuit refugee service mission to mothers and children with severe cognitive and developmental disabilities. Kakuma is known in the vernacular, the humanitarian vernacular, as a protracted refugee situation where families languish, sometimes for decades, due to prolonged conflicts in their own home countries. The land there is not suitable for farming, not arable. Refugees are dependent upon food allowances, 70% of which had been provided by the United States until the recent federal cutbacks. Today, a representative of the World Food Program reports that people there are slowly starving. For many, their lives are not important failures. What Pope Francis called at Lampedusa, the globalization of indifference obscures their stories, deafens their cries. Today, Don has invited us to listen, to hear their stories and their voices. He speaks not of pity, which is what the powerful dispense to the poor, but of compassion, which is literally a suffering with, and entering into the world of another who is, said Simone Weil, exactly like me, although marked by affliction. Dignity, our bearing the very image of God, binds us in solidarity. And it's not only the humanity of refugees that we are betraying, it is our own. Their lives bear testimony to us of hoping against hope, in St. Paul's words in Romans, of a resilience that is born of a refusal to despair. Donald quotes Pope Leo, who speaks of the forcibly displaced, in his words, as privileged witnesses of hope, who face adversity but seek, in the Pope's words, a future in which they glimpse that internal human development and happiness, integral human development and happiness are possible. As one of my Catholic worker colleagues told me years ago, he says, Bill, we who are privileged cannot afford the luxury of despair. What our speaker ends with the words of Dorothy Day, after all, we can only do what lies in our power and leave the rest to God, and God will attend to it. I began with the words of my friend in the Kakuma camp, Charity Lobo, and I'll end with them as well. We lost everything, he said, but God saved us, so we are living. We do not know the future, but we know that God will care for us. Even when we die with God who loves and cares for us. I think the refugees are a word of hope to us. They have not despaired, and neither can we. So what we'll do now, we have the opportunity. Don and I will sit up here, and I'll begin by asking a few questions, and then we'll open it up for any questions that you might have. Donald, in the midst of so much suffering and so much that may discourage us, I know I find it all too easy to succumb, as I say, to the luxury of despair. Even the myth, we may say, of impotence, that there's nothing we can do. What nourishes your hope?
I mean, I put the quote from Dorothy there for a reason. I believe that. I don't think there's people in the world that are desperate as can be, and as you've just indicated, they're hopeful. You know, what right do I have to be disappointed? That would just be kind of selfish. So I don't think that's even appropriate. But the fact is that the refugees are still in place, and they're still caring for each other, and the women in Chicago are still caring for each other, and the citizens of Minneapolis and Chicago and those places. I have this like crazy idea. I think that they should get the Nobel Peace Prize this year. I think that they deserve it because they've been there for each other. Pope Leo, contributing to kind of a body of work that's always been a source of hope, the Catholic social teaching, and so on and on. And then I think a lot of us are just kind of too busy to be anything but tired, and so. Yeah.
Thank you. And a second question. You've already mentioned some of the initiatives undertaken by JRS. what do you believe are the most critical steps that we at Santa Clara, faculty, students, staff, can take today? What, within this context of the university, might you imagine that we could do?
I mean, I imagine that you're doing a lot of it already. I think where you'd always start is with the people that are affected and what their needs might be at this particular time, you know, and there ought to be a way to engage that, and they should be the ones in the driver's seat in terms of kind of saying what they need and what they need from you. So I'm sure that there's students. I'm sure that there's people working here. I know that there's people in the community that badly need your help, your resources, your concern at this point. And so I would start with that. I mean, accompaniment is the word, and encounter, but basically being with people at this time, I think, is the most important thing. I know, like, one of the big ministries right now at the Jesuit Refugee Service is accompaniment. People to, you know, check-in meetings and to court hearings and to buy people groceries sometimes, or whatever the case might be, when they're locked in their house, scared.
Well, thank you, Don. We'll have opportunity now for folks to ask any questions that they might have.
Hi, Don. Thank you so much for your talk, which was kind of searing in a way, but really great to kind of get real about all this stuff and listening and taking it in. I was going to ask you, and perhaps Bill too, if you could comment on this idea of heritage Americans that has been coming up, articulated by people like J.D. Vance and others. And I ask it because when I think of what's going on with all these things, I think, okay, is the big problem here in the eyes of the Trump people that we have so many undocumented people in the country? Or is really what's going on here an effort to literally remake the culture of the country via, you know, in the sort of model of, you know, white, you know, Nordic, whatever the kind of vision of Stephen Miller and Trump are. And I think, so here's a quote from a J.D. Vance speech in July where he says, "America is not just an idea. We're a particular place with a particular people and a particular set of beliefs and way of life." And I think that's the logic fundamentally behind this idea. Really, we're heritage Americans. We come from the soil here, the ground. We don't want people not like us. Could you please comment on that?
I mean, it's risible. It's a joke. I mean, it used to be that, you know, like, yeah, he doesn't think it's an idea because he doesn't share the ideas that everybody had for America for a long period of time. Like, it was a place of hope. It was a place of opportunity. It was a place that was pro-family. It was a place of, you know, strong religion. I mean, and like, since when is he representative of, you know, I don't know, there were Native Americans here, and there were people that were brought in slave ships, and there were successive waves of immigrants from all over the world. I'm not sure what he's talking about. I think that kind of language, though, like, it goes back to, I mean, books by Patrick Buchanan, and it's been around for a long time. He's not creating anything new. He's just kind of, it's a new form of exclusion. And it doesn't connect with anything that I would regard as kind of a core American ideal.
And I would just add that the heritage of this country at its greatest was founded on self-evident truths. We believe human rights. And I think the danger, as Don has said, is that the social contract is becoming a compact of exclusion. And that's betraying the very heritage. If there's anything that has made this country great, it's precisely the opposite.
And, you know, and it's a commitment to our Constitution. Think about that. A commitment to our Constitution and kind of the core institutions in the United States. The idea was that if you came and you were committed, from George Washington on, you were welcome here. I mean, there's no commitment to the Constitution at this point. and you're not welcome anymore, you know. And I don't know what he's talking about. He's just, yeah. I'll say something uncharitable, so I won't.
Thank you for your talk. I was just going to ask if there's one thing you would say to like myself and like my generation, something we can look out for, something we can do to try to fix these problems for ourselves when we get older, and then hopefully our generations after us. What would that be?
It's not one thing, and I think you're probably in a better position than I am, you know. I mean, you know your friends, you know your circles of association, you know how people communicate, you know what their needs are. I mean, I think you can answer that question probably better than we can in terms of being in solidarity and encountering people and kind of working with them. And at this point in our nation's life couldn't be more important when people are feeling extraordinarily vulnerable and unsupported and, you know, endangered.
Oh, hello. Following on from that question, mine is a little bit more specific. What about if we have friends who are close to individual refugees, help people who come from overseas, find them jobs and so on, but still make very generalizing statements about refugees or immigrants in general? They saying things like, they take our housing, they take the places at the nursery schools, kindergarten. How do we help them see that they are friends with some of these immigrants, and yet on the other side they're making these very generalized negative statements? How do we help them connect those dots?
I had mentioned to Don earlier as something Hannah Arendt had said 50 years ago, that the difficulty with consistent lying is not that we believe what is false, but that we cease to believe what is true. And I think one of the dangers is we find solace in our hermetic worlds of like-minded thinking. And bearing witness to the truth, I think, is absolutely critical. And as I say, allowing the refugees to tell their stories, to really be able to have a listening heart to what they are saying, even, as Don said, when that is simply crying. When you see the suffering of another, that's where we have to begin. And the danger, I think, is how often it's the stories of others in which the refugees are inscribed, rather than their own testimony.
I mean, I think there's that collective issue there too. I've always noticed that as well. No, I like this refugee, the one that works in my house or whatever, or this person that goes to church, or that particular. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the rest of them. Well, they're part of the rest of them, you know. And I don't know. It's an odd dodge, it seems to me. You can talk to your friends better than we can, so I think.
All right. So, you know, the Institute for Statelessness and Inclusion estimates there's around 15 million people that are stateless, which, you know, gets at some of the points you're making. They have no rights, no rights to education, no freedom of travel, no citizenship, all this kind of stuff. I mean, and we see this, you know, with all the conflict going on, we see more and more people displaced. I mean, it's hard not to feel despair, though I would acknowledge it's a privilege. But, you know, what is the future for so many people that are being born into these camps who have no rights and no citizenship, no freedom of travel, and they're trapped inside these camps, which is a pretty generous word, probably.
Could just say it. I've learned so much from Don. The 3 years I was in Kakuma, it began, if some of you remember, the Lost Boys of Sudan. Camp began almost 35 years ago. Today it's over 300,000, one of the largest camps in the world now, along with Dadaab, also in Kenya. The average length of stay is 17 years, so children are born there. may not know their languages, their cultures, that what is home for them. The solution probably is some form of settlement, of moving from encampment to longer-term settlement. Tragically, the humanitarian ethos is largely one of care and maintenance rather than addressing systemic and structural conceptions of justice. So that would be the concern. I think when mentioned elements of Catholic social teaching that would try to elaborate on what a just resolution would be, would move towards some form of settlement or integration.
I mean, there's stateless. I mean, what I'd suggest is that there's this stateless group in the United States that I'd get involved in and support. When I was at Center for Migration Studies, we did the study on the number of stateless in the U.S. So we interviewed as many as we could possibly find, and it wasn't a successful study in the sense that we weren't able to do exact estimates, but we were able to identify kind of the populations where the stateless would be, and we were able to interview and find lots of populations of stateless people. So they're here, and they need support now, and they're constantly looking for support and help. So, I mean, that's one place I think to start. The other is just to point out that the whole idea of denying birthright citizenship, that's been the main ingredient and antidote to statelessness in the United States, since the 14th Amendment came into being. And so that they're proposing, and it's allowed every single immigrant family to come in to be only one childbirth away from having a foot in the country, being integrated in that way. So forget about the constitutional arguments, which are on our side almost completely, that this can't be overturned by executive fiat. The Supreme Court seems to be coming out in the right way on it. We'll know in June. But if somehow we lose that, the stateless population is going to rise, and it's going to be, a multi-generational stateless population. So that would be truly horrible and something to fight, like, in any way you can. Any democratic way you can.
One more question, then we'll wrap up, and we have a reception. We can continue the conversation, but we'll do one more question. Yeah.
Hi, I appreciate the mention of opportunity, and I know refugees sometimes is not necessarily economic opportunity that are seeking. There are other elements, but in this world of AI and all the statistics that are happening, the potential of job displacement, the opportunity to migrate or to be in, what we call modernized or advanced societies from like other less developing countries, do you see that is going to affect the way that we need to approach refugee? Of course, it's still going to be at the heart, and the value of like protecting others. But I think that even people that are local are being displaced right now, by the job and the integration of AI workflows.
Could you talk about the AI point, because I'm not understanding how it
Yeah.
connects.
So what happens is that a lot of what is considered maybe menial work that a lot of times was immigrant labor now can be automated, and we're talking about that the advance rate of this technology is pretty rapid. So even within months. So for us, maybe say, robots, it's going to be in 10 years, it might be in 2 years, and a lot of the things that maybe, immigrant labor used to take care of is going to be displaced by AI models.
Yes, that's a big threat and a big challenge, and it needs to be regulated, very, very significantly. And I think even Laudato Si, although it's known as an environmental document, also talked about work and also talked about migration and was concerned about all of those things. So this is another one that Catholics need to get their arms around, because at this point we're being told all of this is inevitable and it's the price of progress, et cetera, like we're always told when there's something new like this. And it needs to be thought through in a kind of reasonable, values driven way, so that there's not this immense loss of jobs and well-being of people.
And just to add, this shows how integrally questions of migration are related to broader systemic structural questions of justice. And just so you may know, within the next few weeks, it's likely we'll have an encyclical by Pope Leo on AI, so be attentive to that, yeah.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Bill, for your remarks. But especially want to thank Donald for his talk, for coming to visit us, and for being here. So, thank you. So thank you. We now have food and some drinks for reception after, just to continue the conversation. But thank you all, and we'll see you again at another event.